Welcome everybody. Thanks for visiting the channel. Today we're going to talk about one of the hardest things that we could possibly imagine tackling on this channel, and yet one of the most central reasons why we started this channel. Is there a God? So right off the bat, I want to introduce this topic by telling you a little bit about myself because I think it is relevant. So I am not religious. I sometimes think there might be a God, but I sometimes think there might not be a God, and I vacillate a lot. I think it's likely that this video is going to resonate the most with other people who are not committed to a specific answer to this question. But I think there's another question that we could ask that's sort of interesting, and we can talk about that further, which is, can you ask the question, is there a God? Can you ask if the universe had a creator in a way that's intellectually nourishing? And is that something we can talk about a little bit more? I think it's an interesting question to ask that, and it's interesting to ask the meta question of whether or not this is a conversation that we can have. But I do want you to know I'm not devoted to a specific answer, and one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video is because when I did research on this topic, I was very unsatisfied with the results that I was getting. There are a lot of intellectual answers to the question of whether or not there is a God that are in the negative, but there are very few, if any, answers to the question of whether there is a God, whether the universe had a creator, that are more intellectually neutral or that come from the affirmative standpoint that aren't based on a specific pre-existing religious notion. So a lot of people that I've found online who answer this question in the affirmative, their answer is almost entirely based on their own pre-existing religious ideas. So let me know in the comments where you stand on the spectrum, if you believe there is a God, if you believe there isn't a God, and let me know if that belief is based on your pre-existing religious values, or let me know if you're like me, if you're sort of not committed to an answer, but you're interested in what we can find out in the journey. All right, that was a bit of a long-winded introduction, but I did want you all to know where I was coming from, and I do think it's interesting to ask the question of whether or not a question like this can be tackled in a way that's neutral, that encourages conversation, and that sort of reinvigorates the conversation with intellectualism. It's definitely true that historically, this question has been dumbed down. So it's almost a hard question to bring up to people today without expecting them to have the notion that you are coming from a religious background. So it's hard to walk up to somebody and ask the question, do you think that God exists? Or to strike this up in conversation because, um, people already have pre-existing notions, pre-existing religious ideas that they're so emotionally tied to that I think that does sort of negate the ability to really have a conversation about this. It's interesting that in antiquity and in ancient philosophical traditions, people did ask the question of, is there a God? Does the universe have a creator? And it was a question that I think was encouraged to be the focus of debate. So it'll be also an interesting question to ask if we can add anything novel to some of the ideas about religion that were handed down from antiquity. Albert Einstein was maybe one of the only sort of recent philosophical minds to put work into the idea of whether or not the universe had a creator. This was largely sort of addressed by Albert Einstein's conception of cosmology. He created his cosmological constant to rationalize that the universe was static and everlasting, to agree with his conception of God. He later on in his life called that his greatest mistake, but his formulation of the cosmological constant did end up giving rise to ideas about dark matter and dark energy. We can talk a little bit more about that later, and that may be a good topic for a separate video. Interestingly, Einstein's somewhat religious adherence to the idea that the universe is deterministic, and that was based on his religious notions as well, led him to become less relevant later on in his life. Certainly with the evolution of theory about quantum mechanics, he always would say, well, God doesn't roll the dice, and that led him to sort of negate quantum mechanics. And as a result, he became less relevant in the scientific community later on in his life. And that's also an interesting topic that we talk about a little bit more in a later video. If you think of big questions that would supplant your existential and philosophical understanding of where you sit in the universe, things like, what if we found intelligent life on another planet? That would really be a massive paradigm shift. And certainly finding out that the universe has a deity, has a creator, would be an even more massive shift and would really dwarf this. So I think it would really be earth-shattering. And for existential reasons, it's important to ask the question, does the universe have a God? Does the universe have a creator? I think that would be a really massive existential shift in our thinking, and it would really shake us philosophically to our foundations. But when I thought more about this question, I realized that it's not as relevant, and that may sound shocking given how much I have propped up this question so far in this video. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the question of is there a God is really secondary, and it's not the primary question. And I'll talk about a little bit more about why. Let's say, as a thought experiment, there's somebody in your life that you trust implicitly. So let's say my best friend from high school came up to me and told me, and I implicitly trusted anything that he said. And he told me, I just found out, I don't have any other information, but I just found out that there is indeed a God, that the universe had a creator. I think that would really be earth-shattering, but the next day, would I live my life any differently? I think I'd have a lot of questions like, what is the morality of God? What value system does God espouse? But if this thought experiment were carried out to its logical conclusion, I think most people would not necessarily live their lives any differently without further information. So I realize that the question of is there a God is in some ways less teleological, and it's secondary to other questions. So this is a set of questions that I tried to strike out at to create basically the background or definitions with which to answer the question of is there a God? And that is, what are the sort of axiomatic or underlying presumed components of any religious set of notions? So what presuppositions exist in any religious formulation? Now, the reason why I want to talk about this idea is because when I have conversations with people who are on either side of the debate about religion versus the sciences, it's often the case that people who are atheists, who negate any religious idea about the universe, they often will argue against specific religions, but they don't offer as many arguments to the hypothesis that there is a religious underpinning to the universe and that spirituality exists. So what I tried to answer with this question is, what are the inherent presuppositions behind any set of religious thought that we can kind of talk about to set definitions for this debate? This will become a little more clear in the subsequent slides, but I basically, in this video, wanted to put out some definitions so that some of the things we talk about when we talk about religion or spirituality would have a more clear conception in our minds of what those things are. And I realized that there are really two central concepts to any religion that has a cosmological narrative. So if you look at all religious or spiritual schools of thought, they all have two central notions that are sometimes overtly addressed, but more often are presuppositions to what their focus is. All right, so one last diversion before I go into the rest of this discussion is I want to address more clearly what are the reasons why I'm talking about this and why I've been unsatisfied with the pre-existing debate. And that is because when I look at research about whether or not there is a God, it's almost always a debate over pre-existing religious schools of thought or pre-existing specific doctrines. Let me give you some examples. So one of the thinkers that I like to listen to is Sam Harris. Really great thinker to listen to, very entertaining, very intellectual, a lot of very interesting ideas. But if you listen to what he's saying about religion versus atheism, he almost always attacks religions rather than inherent doctrine of religions in general. He almost always attacks specific religious bodies or religious groups of ideas. Now, I think that has value. I think that's important to do, and I think it's important to question. But I feel like what he says addresses individual religions specifically and doesn't address the idea of any kind of religious or spiritual school of thought inherently. I hope that makes sense. Another thinker who kind of falls into that category is Christopher Hitchens. I really like listening to Christopher Hitchens, really great thinker. He was a great thinker. Of course, he's passed on, but a really great individual to listen to. Had a lot of very valid criticisms of religion, but again, addressed specific dogmas of specific religious schools of thought rather than addressing religion more broadly. John Lennox is a great mathematician from Oxford. I find his arguments to be very clever. He's maybe one of the more intellectual pro-religion thinkers, but if you've listened to him at all, I think you'll agree with me that his perspective is so steeped in Christianity that any idea that you put towards him, he sort of has the filter of what is the best Christian answer to this. So I do feel like he is an example of people on the affirmative side of this argument who would say, yes, there is a God, but their basis for thinking that is because of pre-existing religious notions. And then I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that many, many other scholars who advocate for the existence of God really do a dishonest representation of the pre-existing thought on this topic. They will quote mine, they'll take a lot of sources out of context, they'll misrepresent evidence and data, and I feel like that is something that happens a lot in this debate, and that's one of the reasons also why I found the pre-existing debate very unsatisfying. All right, so now let's turn our attention a little bit and talk to establish the two things that I've mentioned previously that are the two central ideas that are inherent to any religious school of thought. And I think these are really the primary questions that even are more teleological questions than whether or not God exists. The first question is purposefulness. So every religion presupposes that the universe is created for a purpose. And I think this is maybe a more central question than whether or not the universe has a creator. Certainly it'd be interesting and earth-shattering and mind-blowing if we found out that the universe had a creator, but then our second question, which would be the most important one, which would arise immediately next, would be what is the purpose for the creation of the universe? And that's something that we would immediately want to know next. And I think this is an even more central and even more teleological question than does the universe have a creator? And the second presupposition of any religious school of thought is non-materialism. By that I mean that there is something in the universe that is beyond the mere physical constructs of the universe. So non-materialism can speak to spiritual dualism, that humans have a soul, that humans have a spirit. I think if you say that humans have a spirit, you're automatically in some sort of spiritual or religious camp. I think justice and morality in some ways fall into this category of non-materialism or arise from non-materialistic conceptions of the universe. I want to hesitate when I say that just a little bit because one of the criticisms that's levied against atheism, which I think is untrue, is that it automatically leads to a conception of the universe without morality. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's a justified conviction, but I think there are certain types of morality or certain concepts around morality or justice that fall out of a non-materialistic universe. I'd like to explain the idea of non-materialism in one other way as well. Let's imagine another thought experiment, and let's imagine that there's a computer mind that knows everything that is materialistically known about the universe. So this sort of violates the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Let's say it knows the position, the momentum of every single particle, even to a subatomic scale. It doesn't have to be a machine. It can also be an organic brain. But I think the question that we could ask here is, if you knew everything about the material universe, would you still wonder if there's something else to it? Meaning, if we got to the end of all materially and physically knowable information and data about the universe, Would we be able to answer the question of whether or not there's a soul, or would we say that there's something else? I should say that I don't know the answers to either of these questions. So as I'm embarking on this journey, I'm embarking on it with all of you, that I don't have any answers. I don't know if there's anything other than the material, physical universe. I also don't know if the universe has a purpose. So these are two really primary, really important questions to me that I think are interesting to address, but certainly they're not questions that I have any answers to, and they're questions that I wanted to address at the beginning of this kind of journey that I'm having intellectually and mentally with all of you. Now, there are reasons why these ideas about religion are important. One is it has relevance to the debate of science versus religion. So, certainly when I hear people who are atheists make arguments against religion, they almost always sort of induce, without knowing, a bit of a straw man fallacy, I think, in my mind. And that is to say that they will specifically address individual religions and individual religious sets of ideas, without addressing sort of the broader question of, does the universe have a purpose, which is a more central, a more primary question and a more important question, and without really addressing the question of, is there anything to the universe that is non-materialistic, that exists in any other way, like sort of spirituality or a soul. So that's one of the reasons why this conversation is relevant and why I wanted to define these ideas from the get-go. Another reason is I sort of like thinking of science as a field of thought that answers mechanistics and how, and I like thinking of religious or spiritual debate and thought as a system of thought that basically answers the question of why. Now, certainly, historically, most religions have arisen as explanations for physical observations in the universe. So before we had the sciences, religion came up with explanations for things that early humans observed. And that's certainly likely true. But I think we are at a point in history where we can now change our focus and now sort of disaggregate the two questions. We can separate the how from the why. I realize in most debates, when people advocate for religion, they are still advocating based on the mechanistics of the universe. They're still trying to make sense out of the universe by appealing to a religious authority. But my point in adding to this conversation is to change the focus and to say, let's separate the how from the why. Now, I realize at this juncture that a lot of people have the argument that religion inherently is flawed relative to science because science starts from the concept of information that's not known and then tries to find evidence to answer questions in one way or another, whereas religion starts with having the answer and then works backwards to sort of justify the evidence, justify the conclusion based on an interpretation of the evidence. I think that's a valid criticism of every pre-existing religious school of thought, but I don't think it's necessarily a valid criticism of all religious thought in general, meaning that, again, I think it's not inherent to religious or spiritual thinking to say that you have to have a preconceived notion, you have to have a set of ideas at your starting point. And certainly the whole goal of this channel and these videos is to ask these questions in a way that does not start with the answers. I don't have answers to these questions, but I think it's an interesting journey, and I'm excited to see what I might find, especially with some feedback from folks who are out there listening to this video in the comments section. All right, so that brings us close to the close of this video, because again, this is part one of a very interesting and layered topic, but I wanted to start with definitions of the presuppositions of any religious or spiritual school of thought, because I think that's a good starting point for having this conversation, and I haven't previously seen the debate formulated in this way as clearly in the past. But I really want to thank you all for watching this video. As always, maybe the first and most important message that I want to communicate is please put some thoughts in the comments section, but please be kind in your conversations and be humble in your conclusions. And please like and support the channel. This is a very new channel. It's a very new endeavor. I think in many ways it's a very novel endeavor. So I am curious to see how you all will add to this discussion. I will definitely plan on making more videos on this topic, but I would love to know what your thoughts are. Have we set up definitions of religion that are maybe a little more clear, maybe a little more intellectually defensible, that are maybe things that can be argued in a way that's more intellectual rather than having preconceived notions? Or do you think this is something that's just impossible to extricate from people's pre-existing ideas and values? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments section. If you put any comments in this comment section, I will try to answer each and every one of your comments myself, and I would love to have further conversations in the comment section about what you'd like to see on this channel, what you think we could talk about further. And I hope to grow through the comment section a community of people who hopefully, like you, are intellectually curious and sort of in some ways neutral about your conclusions. If you are already on one side of the debate, I'd also like to hear from you, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are about this video if you're from a really religious background or from a very atheistic background. I'd love to learn more about that. Thanks everybody for watching. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to click the bell for notifications so you'll get informed when we post more videos. And I plan to have more conversations on this topic coming up really soon. Thank you everyone for your support so far. I'm really grateful as a new channel that we've had some kind feedback already, and I super appreciate it. Thanks everyone.